Recently, during the election of the new Pope here in 2025, I was watching a Catholic news channel on YouTube which was providing live coverage of the election. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be tuning into that channel. Anyway, it was pointed out that the place where the Apostle Peter, so-called, was allegedly executed or martyred was right near or right on the Circus of Nero, which apparently overlaps with St. Peter's Basilica. So, given my theory that Nero converted to Judaism and that he was Simon, the resistance fighter in Jerusalem, and then that's the reason that Simon was brought back to Rome to be executed. In fact, we could ask when and where was Simon Bar Giora executed. So here, okay, so it says in 71 CE. I put down 70 CE based on another output. It says he was executed in 71 CE in Rome at the Tarpeian Rock. He was paraded through the city during Vespasian's triumph procession and then thrown from the rock as a symbol of the Jewish defeat after the fall of Jerusalem, as documented by Josephus and other historical sources. So, let's see, Google Tarpeian Rock. This is a cliff in Italy, and it's on the south side of the Capitoline Hill that was used in ancient Rome as a site of execution. Adjudicated murderers, traitors, perjurers, and larcenous slaves, if convicted by the Quaestorius Parricidi, were flung from the cliff to their deaths. The cliff was about 25 meters high. And here's the coordinates. Says early Romans allegedly disposed of handicapped children at the Tarpeian Rock, so that would be where they would expose them to death, or I guess just toss them off the side of the cliff. Lovely, huh? To be hurled off the Tarpeian Rock was, from a certain perspective, a fate worse than mere death because it carried with it the stigma of shame. You're not going to be experiencing shame when you're dead. The standard method of execution in ancient Rome was by strangulation in the Tullianum. The rock was reserved for the most notorious traitors and as a place of unofficial extra-legal executions, such as the near execution in 491 BC of legendary then-Senator Gaius Coriolanus by a mob whipped into frenzy by a tribune of the plebes. How much this sounds like some passages from the Gospels. And then also the fate of Judas. but of course Judas is just seen as the penultimate traitor. I think Judas Iscariot will probably bring it up. Death. Many different accounts of Judas's death have survived from antiquity, both within and outside the New Testament. Blah 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 blah. Afterwards, he committed suicide by hanging himself in accordance with Mosaic law. I don't think hanging yourself is prescribed in Mosaic law. Someone else is supposed to hang you. That's a stretch. Acts 1 states that Judas, I don't care about the damn money. Jeez, they say Jews are so fascinated with money. Seems like Gentile academics are more fascinated with money, especially if it has to do with a Jew. It says that he fell headlong, burst asunder in the midst, and all his bowels gushed out. According to this account, his death is apparently by accident, and he showed no signs of remorse. How faithful the Gospels are. So, wow, there's some pretty incredible apocryphal stories about his death. Says the discrepancy between the two different accounts of Judas's death has proven to be a serious challenge to those who support the idea of biblical inerrancy. First of all, don't associate the Christian addendum with the Hebrew Tanakh, right? The Hebrew Tanakh does not claim the Christian scriptures. So, just because you find an error in the Christian scriptures, that condemns the Christian scriptures. It has nothing to do with the Hebrew Tanakh. Let any error you might find in the Hebrew Tanakh, condemn the Hebrew Tanakh if you're trying to disprove inerrancy. This problem was one of the points leading C.S. Lewis, for example, to reject the view that every statement in Scripture must be historical truth. Nonetheless, various attempts at harmonization have been suggested. Generally, they have followed literal interpretations such as that of Augustine of Hippo, which suggests that these simply describe different aspects of the same event. That Judas hanged himself in the field, and the rope eventually snapped, and the fall burst his body open. Or that the accounts of Acts and Matthew refer to two different transactions. Some have taken the descriptions as figurative, that the falling prostrate was Judas in anguish, and the bursting of the bowels is pouring out emotion. Most scholars reject these approaches. Neither story was meant to be read in light of the other. The integrity of both stories as complete narratives in themselves is seriously disrespected when the two separate stories are being conflated into a third harmonized version. Anyway, so enough about that. But it seemed that Judas must have fallen from some kind of height in order for his guts to burst forth. So, let's see. Let me click on these coordinates. So, It's so hard to read these maps. What is this? Wikimedia Maps. I didn't even know this existed. And then there's the Vatican. So, supposedly executed here. And then here's the Vatican. And, yeah. Where I think the Circus of Nero. Will it let me search for it? I don't see a place to search. How could it not have a place to search? Seems kind of dumb. Open Street. I mean, these are all other services. I would just like to search on this platform. I guess maybe we can do this. I need the Wikipedia entry, and then we'll just open that up. So, there's the Circus of Nero, and then there's the Vatican. So, when and where was the Apostle Peter executed or martyred? The Apostle Peter was martyred in Rome during the reign of Emperor Nero, traditionally around 67 AD. He was crucified, though according to some accounts he requested to be crucified upside down because he felt unworthy to die in the same manner as Jesus. I think it's possible that that's a literary device. It could be saying that being crucified upside down shows that the truth is being inverted here. Maybe he wasn't executed at all. Anyway, it's certainly very curious. The location of his execution is believed to be near the Circus of Nero, with his burial near the north wall of the circus. So Peter died here, according to church tradition, and then that's there, and then okay, so Peter here and Simon Bar Giora there. Now, I drew this little graphic to help put it in order. Now, here's Rome, it's off to the west, and here's Jerusalem off to the east. So Peter supposedly, the Apostle Peter supposedly somehow, under some circumstances, was transported to Rome seemingly freely of his own accord around 42 to 44 CE. Now, for a Jew to make Yerida to Rome, that is to descend in honor by going to Rome in 42 to 44 CE, long before the Roman war against the Jews, seems unlikely to me. Right? Really questionable. As unexpected as Nero going into exile in Jerusalem in 68 CE, or really at any time during his life, given that he was Emperor of Rome. But there it is. The church claims this unexpected thing, and then Jewish tradition claims this unexpected thing. Though I'm not sure Jewish tradition says that Nero went into exile in Jerusalem after he converted. It does seem to put him near Jerusalem in the story where he fires arrows in 4 different directions and they all land in Jerusalem, or they all point to Jerusalem or something. I don't know. It's a strange story. But from that, Nero concludes that they, I'm not sure who they are, wish to blame the Roman war against the Jews on him, suggesting that he might have been the reason for the whole Roman war against the Jews. But it's from this conclusion that he converts to Judaism, I guess, and then he's advised to go by the Jewish people or the sages or someone to go into exile because they believe he would be executed for converting to Judaism, which I think demonstrates that a Roman emperor converting to Judaism would be seen as treasonous. So then, so my theory is that Nero, when he converted, his new Hebrew name was Simon, and that put him in Jerusalem in 70 AD when Titus is laying siege to Jerusalem. Then he's captured in 70 CE, and there is little doubt. I don't see any reason to question the narrative that he was then dragged to Rome for execution. The only question is, why was this one Jew, who was one of like 3 resistance fighters in Jerusalem at the time, I think it's Simon, John, both who are whose fates are predicted at the end of the Gospel of John, showing that the Gospel of John is dependent upon Flavius Josephus, not the other way around. And then I think there's a third one. I believe his name is Menachem. But from what I remember reading the Roman war against the Jews, I think Simon and John seem to be the more active of the 2 resistance fighters, or the more, perhaps more infamous between the 2. Anyway, so at least from the perspective of Titus and his legions, but I could be wrong. I'd have to read it again to be certain about that. But So, again, my theory is that he converts to Judaism. His new Hebrew name is Simon. He's one of the resistance leaders in Jerusalem when Titus lays siege to it in AD 70. He's dragged back to Rome in Eurida in a descent in honor uh, to be specifically executed there. This one Jewish guy. I believe this to be a parallel of another theory of mine, and that is the Aquila, the eagle standard of the Fulminata Legion, the Thunderbolt Legion of the Roman military, when I don't know if it traveled from Rome or from some other assignment, but it endeavored, I think, to head into Judea, and then it was met at the Beit Horon Pass and defeated. And the Aquila was taken possession by the Jewish resistance fighters. I believe it is said it was melted down. Um, I'm not certain about that, just judging, going off of my memory. I would have to confirm that. But given that it was an Aquila and a graven image of an eagle, and given the whole history with the golden calf, you would it's not a stretch to imagine that the Aquila would have been melted down. So my suspicion is that from that melted down Aquila, a menorah was crafted for the temple in Jerusalem. Then Titus lays siege. He destroys to Jerusalem. He lays siege to the temple. He seizes possession of the menorah, at least according to the Arch of Titus, where it is shown being uh, taken back to Rome, or taken rather to Rome, as a symbol of the defeat of the Judeans. But a great display is made of it on the Arch of Titus, and it's still visible to this very day. I believe that the Romans knew that the menorah was the melted down Aquila, and that they make such a big deal about it because they're showing that they rescued the Aquila, because for a legion to lose its Aquila was a great shame, dishonor. So likewise, the Emperor Nero, converting to Judaism, adopting a Hebrew name, as was the practice and still is to this day, going to Jerusalem into exile, acting as resistance fighter against Vespasian and Titus and their Roman forces, then apprehended by Titus's forces. In fact, there's a whole bit about how Simon puts on this scintillating white garment, and Titus's forces were afraid to even touch him. Makes me think that the reason Titus's forces were afraid to touch Simon was because they were aware that he was Nero, a former emperor. Like, no Roman legionnaire is going to so lightly lay their hands upon the currently serving emperor, and probably not even former emperors. It's kind of similar to King David, his treatment of King Saul, how he was very reluctant to lay any kind of hands on or attack King Saul, even though King Saul was trying to kill him. He knew that King Saul had been the Creator's anointed, his Mashiach, and David as either the current, I forget the chronology here, either the current Mashiach king or the Mashiach to be, was reluctant to lay his hands upon the former king. It's just it's a matter of respect amongst elites that, we see in play even today, where the elites never seem to go to jail for any of the crimes they commit, but little old guy who can't even afford a lawyer, he's going to get thrown in the slammer for committing much lesser crimes. And we're supposed to call that justice. Anyway, that's the way it just works in the world. So, anyway, then this singular Jew, albeit along with a whole lot of other Jewish captives who are sent throughout the empire into slavery, sold into slavery throughout the empire, and then there's somewhere there's a little statement about how there were so many Jewish slaves that they could go for so little in the marketplace, as if to add insult to injury. So, anyway, the single Jew, a lot of fanfare is made, a lot of effort has gone to bring him back to Rome, or rather to bring him to Rome, because we're supposed to believe that he was never in Rome before, and to there be executed. So he's executed in 70 or 71, whereas Peter is executed more than likely, or the story that makes the most sense is from 68 or 67 to 68 CE. However, Nero, and then they say during Nero's reign, because they want to blame it on Nero, but then Nero dies in 68. So, and I want you to see the shift that's going on here. These two very unlikely transfers of these two individuals, supposedly two different individuals. For Peter, a Jew, it's Yerida, a descent in honor to go to Rome. For Nero, a Roman, especially an emperor, it's a descent in honor to go to Jerusalem. Why should big-time Roman emperor in Rome go to this podunk little city in some, they always say, like a backwater, but really Judea was a hub of trade, because you had to kind of pass through it in order to get around that part of the Mediterranean. But yeah, so I just wanted to point that out. If Nero had converted to Judaism, then to go to Jerusalem would be an aliyah. It would logically follow that he would go to Jerusalem. If Peter were not Jewish at all, it would logically follow that he might go to Rome. Certainly, if Simon was captured, it's not a stretch to believe that he would be dragged to Rome. The question is just, why this one guy? Why make such a big deal about this one guy? And I think it's because Simon was Nero, converted to Judaism. Peter, we have him at these dates only because the whole Christian myth is backdated to the 30s. And that's supposed to be, to help it be in fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy, blah, blah, blah. I don't give a crap about any of that. What's very clear is that there wasn't any Christianity before 70 AD. All this stuff is backdated. All these traditions about Christians setting fire to Rome and stuff. When scholars admit that Romans had a very hard time differentiating between Jewish messianics and Christians back then. And I would suggest that part of the reason is because Christianity didn't even really exist before 70 AD. That's why you're having such a problem, is because it didn't exist. Instead, you're dealing with all these sources that are backdating all these stories in order to make them fit each other. So there's not a whole lot of explanation as to why Peter would go to Rome. Why a Jew, when he didn't need to, would make Giora to Rome and stay there long enough to be executed there. I mean, it's like going into the belly of the beast. Christians, of course, will say, oh, well, it was to, fulfill his evangelistic mission, blah, blah, blah. But it's really Christian myth based on actual Roman history. This Peter, and if you didn't make the connection, this Peter is the same one called Simon Peter. In fact, we can dwell on that a bit. I just wanted to show that this is a Circus of Nero. This is a circle or a circuit of Nero. Nero begins here, goes to Jerusalem, he's dragged back to Rome, and then the punishment fits the crime. He's brought back to be executed in the Circus of Nero. Maybe not the Simon who's supposedly thrown from that Tarpeian hill, but Peter is reported to have been killed in the circus, or executed, martyred, whatever, in the Circus of Nero. It just all seems rather fitting, doesn't it? So, but we should take a look at Peter's name. Oh, and this is beautiful. Saint Peter, born 1 BC as Shimon Bar Yona. That's Simon, son of Jonah. Simon, son of Dove. Or in other words, Simon, son of Titus. Because Yonah means dove, Titus means dove. also known as Peter the Apostle, Simon Peter, Simeon, Simon, or Cephas. So we can names and etymologies. They have to have a whole section on this because it's a little confusing. And here they say his parent was Jonah or Jonah John. No. So I mean that would just be funny unless Simon splintered off from John during the resistance in the days leading up to the siege or during the siege. I would have to go back into the Roman War of the Jews to see if that was the case. That would kind of explain why Simon might be named Simon, son of John, but not Simon, son of Jonah. But once Simon was captured by Titus, then you could kind of say that Simon was a son of Titus because he became his property at that time. So the New Testament presents Peter's original name as Simon, Simon in Greek. In only 2 passages, his name is instead spelled Simeon. The variation possibly reflects the well-known custom among Jews at the time of giving the name of a famous patriarch or personage of the Old Testament to a male child, that is, Simeon, along with a similar-sounding Greek Roman name. This is so much nonsense because the Shimon, Simon comes from Shimon, which, I mean, we could look it up. Let's see, yeah, so Simon, so it would be under Simeon in the King James Version. And called his name, so there, yeah, Simeon and Levi. And but so Shimon there, or because of this colon looking thing here, one might say, well, it's Shimon, and from that they might get Simeon, I guess. But if you don't have that colon, then it's Shimon. That's the name, Simon, Shimon. So and it looks like it's from the word Shema, but let me check that. Shama, meaning hear or hearken, obey, pay attention, is how I like to translate that one. And Deuteronomy 6:5, I'm guessing. It's used an awful lot. Deuteronomy 6:4. Yeah, hear, O Israel. So Simeon or Shimon comes from the root Shema. So anyway, so back to this. He was later given by Jesus the name Cephas, from the Aramaic Kepha, rock or stone. In translations of the Bible from the original Greek, his name is maintained as Cephas in 9 occurrences in the New Testament, whereas in the vast majority of mentions, 156 occurrences in the New Testament, he is called Petros, from the Greek and Latin word for rock or stone, to which the masculine ending was added, rendered into English. You know, it's possible that Titus may have actually renamed, he may have renamed Simon / Nero as Petros because rocks and stones from the temple that they had destroyed were supposedly used in the rebuilding, or rather the building of the Flavian amphitheater, the Colosseum, where, you know, blood was spilled and all kinds of blood sports. The precise so you know, it may have he may have been using it to describe what a pain in the neck he was, or likening him unto one of the stones of the temple that was being taken to Rome. The precise meaning of the Aramaic word is disputed, some saying that its usual meaning is rock or crag, others saying that it means rather stone, and particularly in its application by Jesus to Simon like a jewel, but most scholars agree that as a proper name it denotes a rough or tough character, both meaning stone and rock are indicated in dictionaries of Aramaic and Syriac. Catholic theologian Rudolf Pesch argues that the Aramaic word would mean precious stone to designate a distinguishing person. Of course, that would be a totally Catholic perspective. This cannot be sufficiently proven from Aramaic, however, since the use of the Aramaic root kip as a personal name has not been proven, and there are hardly any known examples of the word being used to mean precious stone. The combined name, Simon Petros, appears 19 times in the New Testament. In some Syriac documents, he is called, in English translation, Simon Cephas. So, so I wanted to then skip to connection to Rome. So, of course, you know, and I've known, so Catholics believe that they got apostolic authority, the keys to the kingdom, the keys to the priesthood passed down to them from the Apostle Peter. And when I was a Mormon missionary, way back, you know, when I was like much more ignorant than I am now, we used to laugh about this, you know. Oh, sure, as if while you're executing him, he's going to pass off the keys to the kingdom or the keys to the priesthood to the people executing him, right? But if we see Peter as Nero, then it was supposedly Nero that sent Vespasian and Nero, Vespasian and Titus, rather, to conduct the Roman war against the Judeans. I don't know if that's true. I don't know that if it was really his conversion to Judaism and his going into exile that may have prompted the Roman war against the Jews. Of course, there's also that event. Let me see. Legio Fulminata. So, so in 66, after a zealot revolt had destroyed the Roman garrison in Jerusalem, the Fulminata Legion were sent to restore Roman authority. After Cestius Gallus's withdrawal from the siege of the Temple Mount, Fulminata was ambushed and defeated by Eleazar ben Simon in the Battle of Beit Horon, losing its Aquila. However, Fulminata fought well in the last part of the war and supported its commander Titus Flavius Vespasian in his successful bid for the imperial throne. At the end of the war, Fulminata and Flavia Firma were sent to guard the Euphrates border, camping at Miletus. But it doesn't give the year of, here's the Battle of Beit Horon. So that was in 66. So I would think that the Battle of Beit Horon would have prompted plans for the Roman war against the Jews, more than just Nero giving the order. And then that would have been 66, may have been 67. And then that puts us at a year before Nero allegedly dies or converts to Judaism. So anyway, that makes a little more sense to me. Let's see, so coming to Rome. There is no obvious biblical evidence that Peter was ever in Rome, but the first epistle of Peter does mention that the church that is at Babylon, elected together with you, saluteth you, and so doth Marcus my son. Most scholars agree that the city alluded to in this verse is Rome, for which Babylon was a common nickname in Jewish and Christian literature at the time, albeit mostly after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. But here, this was supposedly written before 70 AD, right? Authorship, so one scholar says that he believes 1 Peter was most likely written during the reign of Domitian in 81 AD. How's that the case when Peter is supposed to have been executed in 68 CE? I guess he's saying that it's a pseudonymous work. Another dating issue is the reference to Babylon. Generally agreed to be a claim the letter was written from Rome. It is believed that the identifications of Rome with Babylon, the ancient enemy of the Jews, only came after the destruction of the temple in AD 70, which is, again, after Peter is supposed to have died. Other scholars doubt Petrine authorship because they're convinced that 1 Peter is dependent on the Pauline epistles and thus was written after Paul the Apostle's ministry. Others argue that it makes little sense to ascribe the work to Peter when it could have been ascribed to Paul. One theory supporting legitimate Petrine authorship of 1 Peter is the secretarial hypothesis, which suggests that 1 Peter was dictated by Peter and was written in Greek by his secretary Silvanus. John Eliot disagrees, suggesting that the notion of Silvanus as a secretary... Anyway, whatever the case, the dating is clearly wrong according to tradition. And Bart Ehrman doesn't believe it was written by Peter. And then based on stylistic internal evidences, some scholars do believe it was written by him, but these don't take into account the dates. So we don't have to rely on 1 Peter because it looks like 1 Peter is junk. Here it says, that's Paul's epistle to the Romans. So Paul's epistle to the Romans, written about AD 57, greets some people in Rome by name, but not Peter, whom he knew. There is also no mention of Peter in Rome later during Paul's 2-year stay there in Acts 28, about AD 60 to 62. With regards to the latter, Acts 28 does not specifically mention any of Paul's visitors. So, again, back to this. Peter taking this trip to Rome from 42 to 44 CE is kind of questionable. But Titus taking Simon, the resistance leader, as some kind of victory trophy to Rome against a Jew's will, descending a Jew in honor to Rome, as in bringing him down to Rome in dishonor, is not that implausible. It's very believable. The only question there is, why was this guy singled out? So, and then death and burial. In the epilogue of the Gospel of John, Jesus is presented as hinting at Peter's death. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go. Except for the age thing, this is more descriptive of Simon than it would be of Peter in 68 CE, because like traditions seem to think that Peter was executed in Rome in 68 CE because of the fires in Rome in 64 CE, which were allegedly attributed to the Christians, again according to historians that were either little children around the time this happened, or and I'm talking about a single historian, Tacitus, or other historians who weren't even there. They weren't even living when that happened. And they always like to say, oh, they could have relied on Roman records, but then they can't ever tell you what those Roman records were. You know, it's just some kind of like imaginary library. So, this is interpreted by some as a reference to Peter's crucifixion, but more fittingly, the fates of John and Simon at the end of the Gospel of John are descriptive of the resistance fighters, John and Simon, at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Unitarian theologian Donald Fay Robinson has suggested that the incident in Acts 12, verses 1 through 17, where Peter is released by an angel and goes to another place, really represents an idealized account of his death, which may have occurred in a Jerusalem prison as early as AD 44. You know, that's all backdated speculation. It's like when nerds debate about comic book lore, you know. It never happened, and you're building up accretions on this myth based on derivative speculations on fictional accounts. Early church tradition says that Peter died by crucifixion with arms outstretched at the time of the Great Fire of Rome in year 64. This probably took place 3 months after the disastrous fire that destroyed Rome, for which the Emperor Nero wished to blame the Christians. I don't believe that for a second. There just weren't any Christians then. There may have been a sect called Christians who had nothing whatsoever to do with anybody named Jesus, but there were not any Christians who were believers in Jesus setting fire to Rome. This Dies Imperiae Regnal Day anniversary was an important one, exactly 10 years after Nero ascended to the throne, and it was, as usual, accompanied by much bloodshed. Traditionally, Roman authorities sentenced him to death by crucifixion at Vatican Hill. So, whereas I think one had him dying about here, this has him dying about here. Doesn't really matter. It's obviously very close to the seat of Christianity, where, some people interpret thou art, I think it's thou art Peter, and it is upon this rock I will build my church, or my ecclesia, my assembly, and that coming from Jesus Titus, Jesus being a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, Simon being the rock upon which Titus builds his assembly, the 100,000 plus Jews that he had captured in the Roman war against the Judeans and the Galileans, that assembly that he took into captivity. Anyway, so then some interpret that very literally, that's saying like literally the St. Peter's Basilica would literally be built upon the very place where St. Peter was executed. I've heard that interpretation posed as being from the Catholic perspective. I don't know if that's precise, but that's what I've heard. Others think that what Jesus is saying there is when Peter says, "Thou art the Christ," they're saying that it is his testimony that Jesus is the Christ, the Mashiach, that would be the basis upon which the Christian church would be built. That would be a more metaphorical interpretation. But I think it's safe to say that it is saying that the Apostle Peter, at least in the Christian addendum, the Christian scriptures, is the authority figure upon which the hierarchy of the church would be built. So, in accordance with the apocryphal Acts of Peter, he was crucified head down. Tradition also locates his burial place where the Basilica of St. Peter was later built, directly beneath the basilica's high altar. And somewhere, I heard it was the apse was built right over that. Someone, it might have been Constantine, I'm not sure, insisted that the apse be built right over Peter's burying place. Pope Clement I, in his letter to the Corinthians, written circa 80 to 98, and let me just stop for a second. So, from the Flavian perspective, building your new state cult, your pro-Flavian state cult, where the Flavians would be unwittingly, either knowingly or unwittingly, worshipped as gods, building it upon the place where Nero, a Claudian, had been executed, would make a heck of a lot of sense. Because it's like you're pissing on someone's grave, right? And especially if Nero converted to Judaism, what an insult to build a Christian church over his grave. And really, that would really encapsulate Christianity's attitude toward the Jewish people so perfectly. Pope Clement I, in his letter to the Corinthians, written circa 80 to 98, speaks of Peter's martyrdom in the following terms: "Let us take the noble examples of our own generation. Through jealousy and envy, the greatest and most just pillars of the church were persecuted and came even unto death. Peter, through unjust envy, endured not one or two, but many labors, and at last, having delivered his testimony, departed unto the place of glory due to him." A lot of the supposed persecution and martyrdom of Christians in the first century didn't happen. At least not until Domitian, and possibly even later than that. And it's because Christianity was a state cult that was being created by the Flavians, so why would they persecute their own project? And Vespasian, at least Vespasian, was apparently a respected and loved emperor by Romans. So if Christianity was his little pet project, I don't think anybody would be persecuting Christians then. The whole martyrdom value in Christianity seems to come from, I think, a work called The Lives of the Prophets, where, I don't know if it was Christian writers, let me see if I could look it up. It's not that Lives of the Prophets. We're looking, no, maybe this is it. Yeah, The Lives of the Prophets is an ancient apocryphal account of the lives of the prophets of the Old Testament. It is not regarded as scripture by any Jewish or Christian denomination. The work may have been known by the author of some of the Pauline epistles, as there are similarities in the description of the fates of the prophets, although without naming the individuals concerned. Start of the lives in a 13th century manuscript. The work survives only in Christian manuscripts. There are two groups of Greek manuscripts. The first group includes many versions well known in the past centuries with heavy Christian additions. Some of these, and there would be a reason for heavy Christian additions. Some of these versions were attributed to Epiphanius of Salamis, others to Dorotheus of Tyre. The other group of Greek manuscripts is more stable and free from the interpolations found in the previous group. The best codex is a 6th century CE manuscript, usually referred to as Q, or as anonymous recension, which is the earliest Greek version of this work. There is also a Latin version with a text near to Q, used by Isidore of Seville. Anyway, I'm sorry here. Let me get another cough drop. There is no consensus among scholars about the original language. The preferred use of quotations from the Septuagint suggests a Greek original with Semitic coloring, so they tried to make it look more Jewish. Authenticating the dating is highly problematic due to the Christian transmission and presumed expansions. Torrey suggests a date before 106 CE, Hare, the first quarter of the 1st century CE. Citron proposes an early Byzantine origin in the 4th to 5th century on previous materials, but the date must be before the 5th century, as Torrey writes in his introduction that the lives exist in several different recensions. Anyway, so the content lists like all the prophets, or at least most of the prophets of the Old Testament, and describes how they were all martyred in various ways. And this is based on let me see, which of the prophets did your forefathers not kill? Acts 7:52, blue letter. I think that's Stephen. Yeah, Stephen. This is Stephen's rant where he presumes to recite the Torah to the Sanhedrin. So he says, "Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted?" Let me change this to Revised Standard. Which of the prophets did not your fathers persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. So this is this anti-Semitic accusation made by the Christian scriptures against the Jewish people, accusing the Jewish people who preserved the writings of the prophets in the Hebrew Tanakh of persecuting all of those prophets when those prophets were seen as righteous men in the Jewish community. And the result of that is we get this work that proceeds to describe how all of the prophets were martyred. And this is because martyrdom, with Jesus being the prototypical martyr, although I think Stephen is usually the one called the prototypical martyr, martyrdom becomes a value. It's like this romantic value in early Christianity that if you can be killed just for, providing your testimony, well, then it's a fast track right to heaven. So, but I think the aim of the lives of the prophets is to implicate the Jewish people in the deaths of the prophets, in accordance with the accusation in Acts chapter 7, verse 52. But there's a parallel bit of literature. by, um, I think it was Eusebius. Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century church historian, documented the lives and deaths of the 12 apostles, emphasizing the spread of Christianity and the persecution they faced. Most apostles were martyred for their faith, while some, like John, lived longer, dying of natural causes, only because, according to the traditions, you had to allow that John lived longer, in keeping with the already received narratives, probably. Um, Here's a more detailed look. Um, let's see. So somewhere back again when I was a Mormon missionary, back around 1990, 1991, I had a list of the fates of the 12 apostles because even in Mormonism it was valuable to show that the various apostles died for their testimony of Jesus, because that somehow like lends credence to the testimony. It couldn't be like 12 idiots who died for believing in something false. No, the fact that they were killed for speaking about what they believed in somehow makes their testimony more true. This whole value of martyrdom, and somewhere I believe that there is a list, maybe it's in Eusebius, of the fates of the various apostles of Christianity. But I want to show that this value of martyrdom is a Christian thing. In the Torah, you're obeying the Torah for life. To lead a prosperous, successful, blessed life, not to turn around and die for your testimony because you want to get fast-tracked to heaven. The Torah is a lifestyle. The law of Moses is a lifestyle. It's not a death style. Christianity took on this romantic value of martyrdom, and for some, along with Christian asceticism, it became a death style. Islam, derivative from Christianity and others, possibly the Ebionites and who knows what else, Islam also took upon themselves, needing that credibility of martyrdom, they took upon themselves also this value of martyrdom, so that Islam became a death style. But in Judaism, still to this day, Torah is a lifestyle, not a death style. People who were most prone to giving up their lives for a falsehood are also the sort of people who would be inclined to throw away their lives for a lifestyle. Whereas in Judaism, there are only some commandments that you can throw your life away for in order to prevent breaking them. Otherwise, the large majority of the commandments of the Torah you can break in order to preserve your own life. One of the greatest profanities in human existence right now are Palestinian mothers who raise their toddlers to want to hate and kill Jews, so that when they grow up, they throw their lives away just to have the privilege of killing a Jew, and usually get killed in the process or afterwards, after having committed their murder of Jews, believing that in doing so they get fast-tracked to heaven. What kind of stupid belief system has a mother going through 9 months of labor to produce a little murderer who's going to just, as quickly as possible, leave this life? Maybe not even stick around long enough to get married and have little murderers of their own. It's clearly a stupid belief system. So we don't need this. So Jerome wrote that at Nero's hands, Peter received the crown of martyrdom, being nailed to the cross with his head towards the ground and his feet raised on high, asserting that he was unworthy to be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. Anyway, so there's a whole section here on the death of Peter, according to various Christian sources. You can look at that. I mostly wanted to point out how there wasn't much evidence in the Christian scriptures for Peter's coming to Rome, and that is quite in harmony with the Jewish mindset which Peter is supposed to have had. Wanting to descend in honor to go to Rome, to the belly of the beast, where people eat pig, where there's no kosher food, except maybe again amongst little tiny Jewish neighborhoods, maybe. It just doesn't make much sense. Especially given that the diaspora is described as Sheol, the abode of the dead, in Scripture. So, enough with that. And then somewhere here, there was more about the death of Nero. This gets into a little more detail than we've previously covered about Nero's death. So, in response, Nero fled. Well, let's continue. While Nero had retained some control of the situation, support for Galba increased despite his being officially declared a public enemy. Who, Galba or Nero? The prefect of the Praetorian Guard, Gaius Nymphidius Sabinus, also abandoned his allegiance to the emperor and came out in support of Galba, so abandoned his allegiance to Nero. In response, Nero fled Rome with the intention of going to the port of Ostia. Okay, so we're to believe that he fled Rome to commit suicide, right? But here it says he fled Rome with the intention of going to the port of Ostia, and from there to take a fleet to one of the still loyal eastern provinces. What, like Judea? According to Suetonius, Nero abandoned the idea when some army officers openly refused to obey his commands, responding with a line from Virgil's Aeneid, is it so dreadful a thing then to die? Nero then toyed with the idea of fleeing to Parthia, throwing himself upon the mercy of Galba, or appealing to the people and begging them to pardon him for his past offenses, and if he could not soften their hearts, to entreat them at least to allow him the prefecture of Egypt. Suetonius reports that the text of this speech was found later in Nero's writing desk. Oh, wow. Come on, dude. That's your source. But that he dared not give it from fear of being torn to pieces before he could reach the forum. Wow. Keep in mind, these historians, they're writing probably during the Flavian dynasty or after. They're not writing this during Nero's reign. This is not contemporaneous eyewitness testimony. Returning, Nero sought a place where he could hide and collect his thoughts. An imperial freedman, Phaon, offered his villa 4 miles outside the city. Traveling in disguise, Nero and 4 loyal freedmen, Epaphroditus, Phaon, and Neophytus and Sporus, reached the villa where Nero ordered them to dig a grave for him. So he's collecting his thoughts and then telling somebody to dig a grave for him. At this time, Nero learned that the Senate had declared him a public enemy. Nero prepared himself for suicide, pacing up and down, muttering, "What an artist the world is losing," or rather, I've heard it also, "What an artist dies in me." Losing his nerve, he begged one of his companions to set an example by killing himself first. That is really strange. At last, the sound of approaching horsemen drove Nero to face the end. However, he still could not bring himself to take his own life, but instead forced his private secretary Epaphroditus to perform the task. This is why Christian commentators don't want to link the Epaphroditus of the Christian scriptures to this Epaphroditus, possibly because of dating, but also because this is the guy that executed Nero, supposedly. When one of the horsemen entered and saw that Nero was dying, he attempted to stop the bleeding, but if he ran, okay, if this really happened, if he rammed, all he needed to do, and there were statues showing how this was done, all you had to do was ram a blade behind your clavicle, and they say you'll die in like 3 seconds. When one of the horsemen entered and saw that Nero was dying, he attempted to stop the bleeding, but efforts to save Nero's life were unsuccessful. Nero's final words were, "Too late, this is fidelity." I'm not quite sure I understand that, but this may have been an attempt to gloss over Nero's infidelity in converting to Judaism. He died on 9 June 68, the anniversary of the death of his first wife, Claudia Octavia, and was buried in the mausoleum of the Domiti Ahenobarbi in what is now the Villa Borghese, Pincian Hill area of Rome. According to Sulpicius Severus, it is unclear whether Nero took his own life. That was a Christian writer. A Christian writer in 363 to 425. We didn't really need someone 300 years, even, what would that be? That would be, 300 to 350 years later to tell us that they didn't really know what was going on. We could have figured as much. Um, with his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. Chaos would ensue in the year of the four emperors. Um, yeah, until Vespasian, who was conducting the Roman war against the Jews, was urged by his soldiers to become emperor. And I'm not sure if it was at sword point his soldiers persuaded him to become emperor, as if to say, oh, Vespasian didn't really want to become emperor. He wasn't really trying to climb the success ladder. It was really his soldiers, out of respect for his character, that insisted that he fulfill his duty and become emperor. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, the people of Rome celebrated the death of Nero. Tacitus, okay, yeah, Suetonius and Cassius Dio, you can't even rely on them. They're like too far removed. Tacitus, at least, was alive at the time. He describes a more complicated political environment. Tacitus mentions that Nero's death was welcomed by senators, nobility, and the upper class. The lower class, slaves, frequenters of the arena and the theater, and those who were supported by the famous excesses of Nero, on the other hand, were upset with the news. Members of the military were said to have mixed feelings as they had allegiance to Nero, but had been bribed to overthrow him. Eastern sources, namely Philostratus and Apollonius of Tyana, mention that Nero's death was mourned as he restored the liberties of Hellas with a wisdom and moderation quite alien to his character, and that he held our liberties in his hand and respected them. Modern scholarship generally holds that while the Senate and more well-off individuals welcomed Nero's death, the general populace was loyal to the end and beyond, for Otho and Vitellius both thought it worthwhile to appeal to their nostalgia. Nero's name was erased from some monuments in what Edward Chaplin regards as an outburst of private zeal. Many portraits of Nero were reworked to represent other figures. According to Eric R. Varner, over 50 such images survive. This reworking of images is often explained as part of the way in which the memory of disgraced emperors was condemned posthumously, a practice known as damnatio memoriae. So that might be why Nero sometimes looks like such a chinless neckbeard, as maybe they reworked busts of Nero to portray him in an unflattering way. Champlin doubts that the practice is necessarily negative, and notes that some continued to create images of Nero long after his death. Damaged portraits of Nero, often with hammer blows directed to the face, have been found in many provinces of the Roman Empire, 3 recently having been identified from the United Kingdom. Probably, who knows what the reason for that was. Maybe Christians who saw Nero to be the Antichrist, and which Nero was called the first Antichrist. After Nero's death in AD 68, there was a widespread belief, especially in the eastern provinces, that he was not dead and somehow would return. This belief came to be known as the Nero Redivivus legend. The legend of Nero's return lasted for hundreds of years after Nero's death. August of Hippo wrote of the legend as a popular belief in AD 422. And then at least 3 Nero impostors emerged leading rebellions. Another, whose face was similar to that of the dead emperor, appeared in 69 AD during the reign of Vitellius. What are the chances that maybe one of these so-called impostors really was him, but wasn't received as him because the Roman establishment had already put it out that Nero had died? After persuading some to recognize him, he was captured and executed. Sometime during the reign of Titus, 79 to 81, another impostor appeared in Asia and sang to the accompaniment of lyre and looked like Nero, but he too was killed. 20 years after Nero's death, during the reign of Domitian, there was a third pretender. He was supported by the Parthians, who only reluctantly gave him up, and the matter almost came to war. Wow. Boudica's uprising happened under Nero, apparently. Anyway, so let's see. And then here's the Circus of Nero is right here. And then, wasn't it right about here, I think? Right, I can't, I can zoom in on it a lot. No, that's about as much as I can zoom in on it here. Wasn't it about here that they said Peter was executed in one source? But this is the Circus of Nero. It's supposed to be right here. Also, there's actually, let me do XAI. Are Nero's meadows and the gardens of Nero technically the same as the Circus of Nero? Nero's meadows, the gardens of Nero, and the Circus of Nero are related but not technically the same, as they refer to distinct features within the same general area in ancient Rome, now part of Vatican City. So, in talk about the death of Peter, and also the, you'll see mentions of Nero's meadows or the gardens of Nero, and also the Circus of Nero. So Nero's Meadows refers to a broader area beyond the Tiber River, known as the Ager Vaticanus. It was called Nero's Meadows until the Middle Ages due to its association with Emperor Nero's activities, particularly after the Great Fire of 64 AD. The area was used to lodge Romans displaced by the fire, and was the site of mass executions of Christians in 65 AD, blamed as scapegoats for the fire. This term likely encompasses the open, possibly grassy areas around the Circus of Nero and adjacent estates, giving it a pastoral connotation. It's more a regional description than a specific structure. Gardens of Nero. These likely refer to the Horti, luxurious private estates with gardens in the Ager Vaticanus, particularly the Horti Agrippinae, inherited by Nero from his mother Agrippina the Elder. These gardens were part of the patrician residences developed in the area from the late 1st century BC. Nero used these estates to house displaced Romans after the 64 AD fire and for spectacles, including Christian persecutions, as described by Tacitus, who notes Nero offered his gardens for such events. The gardens were adjacent to or near the Circus of Nero, but they were distinct as landscaped residential areas, not the circus itself. Some sources also suggest Nero's gardens could include landscaped areas around his Domus Aurea, Golden House, elsewhere in Rome, but in the Vatican context they are tied to the Horti. Circus of Nero, also known as the Circus of Caligula or Circus Gaius. This was a specific structure, an ancient Roman arena built under Caligula in circa 40 AD, and so maybe that was why Peter went to Rome, is he wanted to check out the sports events in 42 AD, just 2 years after the Circus of Nero was built, or the Circus of Caligula. And it was completed by Claudius. Located in the Ager Vaticanus, it was initially a private circus for chariot racing, later made public by Nero to showcase his charioteering and gain popularity. The circus was about 540 meters long and 100 meters wide, with a central spina featuring an obelisk brought by Caligula, now in St. Peter's Square. It was the site of significant events, including the martyrdom of St. Peter and other Christians in 65 to 67 AD. The circus was abandoned by the mid-2nd century AD. So like 150 AD? Why? And Constantine later built St. Peter's Basilica over part of its site, incorporating some of its structures. Probably because the Circus of Nero was replaced by the Flavian Colosseum. So it says the sources rely on ancient texts like Tacitus and modern archaeology, but they can oversimplify or conflate terms. The Meadows label may exaggerate the pastoral nature of an area that was increasingly developed with structures like the circus and tombs. Always cross-check with primary sources or archaeological studies for precision. In summary, Nero's Meadows, the Gardens of Nero, and the Circus of Nero are not the same but are interconnected within the Ager Vaticanus. The Meadows refer to the broader area, the Gardens to the adjacent estates, and the Circus to the specific chariot racing arena. So, I think we'll stop there. I'll probably think of points that I wanted to bring up later. But all of this was to demonstrate this circuit or circle of Nero. How it looks like it was very probable that Nero did convert to Judaism, that his name, he took on a Hebrew name, probably Simon, and that he was carted back to Rome by the Roman Flavians, and executed in close proximity, at least, to the place where the Apostle Peter supposedly was executed by Nero. It all seems like it's intentionally fitting to me. So, we'll stop there.